Welcome to the TTS Talking Teachers podcast with me, your guest host, Mr. P. Now, in each episode, I'm going to be joined by topic experts from different industries from across the globe, offering exclusive insights, inspiration, and guidance to support you with the highs and lows of teaching. So in today's episode, I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Martin Brunet as today's guest. Martin, how are you doing today?
Yeah, good, thank you.
Thank you so much for coming and joining us. So before we do get started and get into the conversation, for anyone who doesn't know you, isn't aware of your work, would you like to give us a quick sort of introduction about yourself?
Yeah, so I'm a GP. I work 3 days a week as a GP in my practice near Guildford, and then I spend probably a day a week otherwise teaching GPs, particularly GP trainees, writing, talking about mental health and other things. Yeah. And recovering from the rest of the week.
We were just saying just before we started the episode, we were almost going tit for tat as to who's got it worse at the minute. Yeah. Yourself who works within the NHS or me as a teacher. I am also tempted to sort of just use this podcast time to just have time with a GP and go through everything myself. Got a list that I've been trying to speak to someone about. But no, so today the sort of focus is around, we're going to first of all start around sort of burnout. Yeah. Which I know is an issue that affects so many teachers. I think research or the numbers have just come out again this week or in the past week about the retention in education. For the second year running, it's at a record high of around 40,000 teachers leaving the profession. Yeah. The workforce has grown by 200, which is worrying. Yeah. But not a surprise. No. It's not, I don't think there's anything that's happened in the past year that's improve that retention. I think for a lot of teachers, burnout is one of the reasons why so many of us leave. Because I find the amount of messages I get from teachers that end up leaving the profession to go to lesser paid jobs, but they'll say it's just a better quality of life. So
not that teaching is particularly well paid.
Well, no, it's not. But yeah. So if we start off, I mean, what would you say? Is there a particular type of person that you find gets burnout, or is it everyone has the potential?
No, there absolutely is. And interestingly, the sort of person that gets burnout is often the person that least thinks they're the sort of person to burn out. Yeah. So when I see people with burnout who have actually burnt out and collapsed in a heap, they're often very bewildered. They're often, what's happened to me? I'm not the sort of person to get depressed or get anxious, is what they'll often say. And that's because they're generally very strong people. Yeah. They're people who, when the going gets tough, they just pedal harder. They just try harder. They often set high standards. They want to do things well. They care about doing things well. They care about what they're doing. They might be quite vocational in doing it. And they've sort of bought into this idea that as long as you're strong enough, you'll be all right. Yeah. And yet, I don't like thinking of anyone as a weak person, but if you imagine what a weak person might look like, they wouldn't actually take on enough to burn out if they're whatever we mean by weak. So it's strong people that take on too much and often don't notice the signs, and then it's like they fall off a cliff and it suddenly goes wrong. So, and it's often the sort of person that cares about what they're doing. So why do people go into teaching? Usually because they want to make a difference. Yeah. They want to care for people. Yeah. So it's often people in a sort of a caring type profession who are potentially more vulnerable. And they also, potentially someone who gets burnt out is maybe a little bit vulnerable to criticism or self-criticism. In other words, they set themselves really high standards, and if they're not meeting those standards, then they beat themselves up about it. They find it hard to say no, find it hard to delegate, and ultimately,
perfectionists.
Yeah, almost. Very often perfectionists.
Yeah. And so you sort of described it there that for a lot of people it sort of comes on them without them realising. Yeah. So are there any signs to be aware of, to look out for in that build up before, to avoid?
Yeah, because it often is a bit like a cliff. And when someone crashes, then it's like, my goodness, all of a sudden I'm having a panic attack, or I can't face going into work, I can't open my emails. So beforehand, I feel like there's a long plateau where you're still functioning, you're probably not performing as well as you do normally, but you're still doing very well before the cliff edge.
Yeah.
And spotting those signs is key. So they'll be different for different people. I think a sense of being overwhelmed is probably an inner sense you might have where, maybe you're looking at the week and just thinking, how am I going to get through it? When am I going to do that prep? How am I going to do that marking? I've got this to do, I've got that to do. And where do I put it all? And that sense of panic you might feel. So you might get that. You might get sort of compassion fatigue. Normally you'd be really kind with that people, but you just were irritated by them or that other staff member. Surely, never. So it might be irritability. It might be you've been a bit tetchy. It might be you're just... It's funny, even on a day-to-day basis, we all have our sort of tells, our shows of when we're a bit stressed. I know, if you ask anyone at my work, ask me, how can they tell if I'm stressed? I move quicker through the practice.
Right.
I walk faster and I barely stop. Now, that's just on that day. But we'll have tells that we're getting stressed, and it might be irritability. It might be not sleeping well, waking up in the middle of the night and thinking over lesson plans or worrying about this pupil, that pupil, not being able to get back to sleep. Sometimes it's actually I need that glass of wine when I get home in an unhealthy way. Sometimes it can be how much we're drinking can be a sign. Yeah,
actually, that is because there's I don't know what the statistics are, but there is a real correlation between teachers and how much they drink alcohol. I got told off actually because I made a meme on one of my pages about like drinking a wine or whatever it was, and someone messaged me going, you don't realise just how big the problem is in correlation with that.
Yeah, we can always joke about gin o'clock and all of that sort of thing, but actually, if alcohol in moderation is fine, but alcohol, I need that drink. Since I had a GP trainee once that said her journey home was half an hour, and she said she thinks that saved her from being an alcoholic because when she was leaving work, she needed a drink. Actually, by the time she'd calmed down, she was okay. But that can be unhealthy.
And so, what would you say are things that can help us sort of not get to that cliff edge? Yeah. So, if we can recognise things, what can we put in place to maybe help us not get to that point?
So I think there's individually, and then maybe we could look at what a school can do as well. So I think individually, we are actually good as humans at taking on stress, and sometimes we thrive in a crisis. So I don't think we should think that any stress is a bad thing.
No.
But sustainability, particularly through the week, I think is really important, and not just making your life sustainable with the holidays. We were chatting about holidays before we came on air. So you need to feel you've got some breathing space in your week, and that might be at a weekend, or it might be a day a week when you don't do any schoolwork after school and you go and do things that you enjoy doing. Just making sure there's enough time for family, for friends, for things that are really important. There's often things that they're never urgent, but they're important to us, so the ones that get squeezed out.
Absolutely,
that might be time with family, it might be exercise, it might be doing something creative.
Yeah.
So making sure we've got that space is really key, because if everything's jammed, then we're in a bit of trouble.
Yeah.
I sometimes think about, have you got enough space to breathe in your week?
Yeah. And it's hard because I think for teachers, we've just got so much on our plate. We find ourselves unable to give ourselves that time. So I suppose that then leads us on to the workplace culture of what sort of leadership should be looking at doing so that teachers feel they can have that time.
Yeah. So there's two aspects really. One is making sure that teachers are allowed to have that time, don't feel guilty that if they if they spend any time looking after themselves that they're somehow letting the school down.
There's a culture thing with that in teaching though. I don't know if it's the same within the healthcare, but there is, I talk about all the time, this sort of teacher martyrism, that you do get some teachers who not necessarily brag, or they might just moan about, I work more hours than everyone else, and there's almost this acceptance that you've got to work yourself to the point. And I think the danger with that, because we all work differently and some people can handle it, but it almost gets projected on teachers that that's what we should be doing. So if you're seeing a teacher who seems to be eat, sleep, drink, repeat teaching all the time, up until God knows, and you compare yourself to that. And I think we've got to change that mentality because, as I've said previously, I think the best resource in the classroom is the teacher. But I feel for a lot of teachers, they'd love to give themselves that time, but just don't know or don't feel they can because the work, the sort of school expectations as well can almost force teachers to feel like they've got to work themselves to that point.
No, that can be a real challenge, and things like, how do you handle emails at weekends and all of that can be a real challenge. I think one thing I think has a really big impact, especially within education and health, but potentially in any profession, is also moral issues. So there's moral distress is something that really interests me, which is where we're asked to do something in a way that's against our values.
Right.
And I see it as a bit like a magnifier that can either multiply the load that you're feeling, or if you've got it right, actually reduce it. So you can actually carry a big capacity and thrive with it. So, and I think there are external things that can cause moral distress and then internal things in a school. So external things would be where, for instance, the system is letting a child down. You know that they've got a big safeguarding issue, but you can't get them assessed. You know they need an EHCP and it takes 2 or 3 years to get one. You're distraught about the family setup because you know it's upsetting the child and you can't change it.
Which I think for a lot of teachers, that's become such a bigger issue in the past few years, given everything that's going on, cost of living crisis. I think the SEND issues in so many schools. So that point there of not getting diagnosis or just not having the budget for support. So I know there's so many children who are within maybe a mainstream setting that teachers, it's out of our hand. We just can't give the children the necessary support. And that must I know that has such a impact on teachers' mental health.
It's a big issue and it's a tricky one because it's not one that you or the senior leadership can
necessarily
change. And then you've also got some external things where maybe an education centre has told you must teach in this way and it's against your beliefs with education, and that can also be a real frustration. So then the question is, well, what can you do in the school? Because you can also have moral distress in a work environment. So, for instance, cynicism, bullying, gossip. Leaders, being unkind to, teachers and the other way around. That all adds a huge load to moral distress.
And I think for people outside of education, they don't fully appreciate how much of that can happen in schools and can go on. It's like at this point, we're recording this beginning of June. Just simple things like, what the staff list is going to be like for next year and the rumours start. And that can have a huge, because, if you're unsure of what's going to happen, what year group you're going to be in. And again, I hear stories of how some senior leaderships can really play into that as creating that sort of fear within the staff, which I don't get. I'm very lucky in my school. Like my senior leadership team are incredible, and I feel so fortunate in that they've been so accommodating with me and everything that I've gone on to do. But some of the stories you hear about leadership teams, there was one where the leadership teams were sitting in with teachers on their PPA to actually monitor what the teachers were doing in their PPA. And I just feel like, for me, teachers are at their best when they feel valued and trusted. And that was just an example of how it screams, we don't trust you. Because in another school, you'll have teachers who are allowed to take the PPA at home. So how within one education system can things be so varied?
Or you might have a senior leadership who joins you for your PPA in a supportive,
I'm
part of the team, let me help you out. And that's utterly different, isn't it? So it's all, I think and things, it's interesting, the class allocation each year, it's a big deal for teachers and for pupils. And if that's communicated really well and it's fair, then actually, that's great. If gossip starts getting out and rumours, and you feel like, well, the last teacher that went and spoke to the head teacher gets their way, and the other, then that creates real issues.
Yeah.
So I think the culture in a school, if you have a school where your culture is we don't gossip, and you know that actually no one gossips, and gossip is, really not, countercultural to the values of that school, you're going to have a school where actually teachers, thrive, even though it's tough. I mean, it's a tough job.
Yeah.
But you can have another school, the workload's the same, and yet you've got a gossip culture, and everyone's crumbling. So,
but can gossip ever be a good thing?
Proper gossip, I'd say no.
No.
Banter, humour.
Yeah.
Not taking ourselves too seriously. Yeah, that can be really good. But yeah, proper gossip.
No.
It's just
where it's there's an ulterior motive.
Yeah, or it's just
to undermine.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Or to be in the know, it forms cliques, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So,
what impact do you feel Ofsted have with moral distress?
Huge.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting. Because our equivalent is the Care Quality Commission.
Yeah. Okay.
And it hasn't been around as long, hasn't been as awful. And I was doing some reading up about CQC years ago and came across some research about Ofsted being a bit like a thing called the panopticon.
Right.
So the panopticon was a 19th century polymath called Jeremy Bentham came up with this idea of a prison called a panopticon. And the prison was like a donut, and all the cells looked into the middle of the donut, and they all had glass walls on the inside, so you could look into every cell.
Yeah.
Then you had a courtyard was the whole of the donut, and right in the middle was a guard tower. And the guard could, from that vantage point, see any prisoner they wanted at any time.
Right.
And the papers there was some qualitative research saying actually that's what it feels like for teachers.
Yeah.
It feels like you can be spotted at any time. And it creates a real culture of fear.
Oh, absolutely.
Which is just so destructive. So you have a lot of anxiety among senior leadership team of, any time we could be caught out, they could come and strike. Will it be fair? Will it not be fair? And then that bounces down to the rest of the staff because they're under pressure to perform. And it's
really hard, I think, for senior leadership teams to not put that pressure on teachers, because ultimately it's the senior leadership team's heads on a plate if it doesn't go well. Yeah. So how hard it must be to not put that pressure. But by putting that pressure on, it doesn't really help teachers, does it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's such a shame because you could have, you need to make sure schools are doing a good job.
Absolutely.
You could do that in a supportive way that, ultimately could lead to change if schools are not changing, but you could do it in so much better way. And, teachers have been saying that for years, but it's just not politically been acceptable enough to bring change, which is awful.
Well, we've seen it recently, the numerous pieces of evidence coming out against getting rid of those one-word judgments, and the government were like, no, we're going to keep them because it gives them a tagline to say that they've had a positive impact.
Yeah, and, the fact that you have to have a report that talks about the risk of death.
Well, yeah.
Is just in itself utterly shocking. There shouldn't be anything that risks you dying, in a school.
No, I know. I think the thing that I think that was really that struck a chord for a lot of teachers and school staff with the Ruth Perry case was that I think so many of us could understand how you could get to that point. And I felt incredibly inspired to ensure that changes, and that doesn't need to be the case. Yeah. So just going back to the equivalent with yourself as a GP, what did you say it was called?
The Care Quality Commission.
So from your knowledge of both, what are the main differences, or what do you think Ofsted need to change to be more like? Or is it a decent system?
It's got some of the same problems. I think. I mean, we still have the one-word judgments.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's been quite as draconianly applied, and hasn't been going for as long either. So most practices have had, one or maybe two CQC inspections since it came about.
Yeah.
So, and I think a huge difference for GPs is most GPs are a partnership model, so I'm one of 8 partners.
Right.
Ultimately, if we get a bad judgment, it's us, all of us together.
Right.
Whereas a head teacher, it's them,
Yeah,
and they
yeah.
usually lose their job. You know, if we get a bad judgment, actually, it's our business. You know, it's miserable, but you know, no one can actually sack us,
Right?
Because that's a totally different business model. We're all
Yeah.
kind of self-employed. It's a bit of a peculiar model for GPs, but you don't have that threat. Whereas, you know, I often feel head teachers must feel a bit like Premier League football managers who can lose their job at any moment. And you know, and that would be fine if you were paid like they were.
Well, yeah.
So it's very cruel, I think, and it really needs to change. And you know, Ruth Perry has really highlighted this, but it's clearly the tip of the iceberg. And you know, it's not just suicide
because it's a moral distress. Going back to what you were
totally
saying there,
is.
because so much of what you judged on with Ofsted, so much of it is outside of your control as well. You know, so the distress of like having a judgment passed on you when your hands are tied with so many aspects of it. So I mean, what would you like to see change? What would you know, if you could?
So I'd like to see it supportive. I mean, a really good Ofsted inspection with a fair inspector who's valuing what you're doing can actually be a morale boost, you know. So it doesn't have to be a bad thing.
Yeah. To be fair, my school had Ofsted probably about 6 weeks ago, and compared to some of this is what really frustrated me is we had what you've just said there of what it should be like was what our experience was. Yet within the same week, some of the horror stories I heard from schools. So that inconsistency, I think, is one of the biggest issues, because I'm not going to tar every inspector with the same brush and say they're horrible, terrible people, because the ones we had were really, really supportive. But it's just a shame you've not got that across the board. And I think because you've not got that across the board, that's what creates more of that fear, because even if you've just got one terrible inspector within 100, there's still a small chance you might get them, and so that creates that fear.
The whole fear for everyone, and that's the challenge.
So
I think, I mean, for mental health of teachers, getting rid of the one-word judgment would really help. It would be a massive change.
Oh, absolutely.
And then it would be more supportive. And what's a shame is it's often seen that, but Ofsted's there for the parents. Well, you know, as a parent, I mean, my children are grown up now, but wouldn't I want the teachers in the school to have good mental health? Wouldn't they be better at teaching my children?
Well, absolutely,
if they do.
And,
you know, that they enjoy what they're doing and they're not leaving. So, you know, for parents, surely we want teachers to be in a good place.
Well, I think Ofsted, it should come into schools to focus on that. Sort of come into schools to focus on the retention of the teachers and sort of question, you know, how are you doing things? Is that necessarily the best? You know, if you're visiting a school, because I visited a school that was deemed outstanding, and the turnover of staff at that school is through the roof, and you're just going, you can't have a school that's turnovers. It's not quite right. So I think if Ofsted were to put more of a focus on how can we, and it's hard, you know, Ofsted will say, well, you know, we ask about well-being, but for me, that's quite hypocritical when they're one of the reasons it's as, you know, workload and pressures through the roof. So I'd love to see more of a focus on supporting teachers, helping teachers get a better work-life balance, setting, you know, boundaries with things, which is something else we should talk about in terms of burnout. So how do you feel teachers can effectively put boundaries in place to support their mental health?
So I think there's an interesting balance here, because definitely people who burn out often need to learn how to say no.
Well, before, when you were talking about the signs of burnout, it was that's the first thing. Like, teachers innately have that; they just can't say no. I'm sure this is the same with the NHS. I always feel that, like, with that job we do, it's got to a point now where the system, the sort of innate nature we have as teachers to be supportive, our dedication, our goodwill is almost weaponized against you to work to that point.
I think a lot of that depends on the culture within the school.
The school,
So it certainly potentially can be, and I think, it's interesting to think, why do we not say no sometimes? So sometimes it's just because it's in our nature that we struggle to do that. Sometimes it's because we don't want to let go.
Yeah.
And it's, we're maybe a little bit too controlling over something. We don't want to let go. And sometimes when we let go, someone else steps in and even does it better. Sometimes it's because there's a culture where you're not allowed to. But I do think it's important when you say no that there remains kindness in saying no.
Yeah.
Because sometimes, with burnout, it can be, well, I've got to look after myself. And the danger then is you become very internally looking and potentially selfish. And just, say no in an unkind way. And no, I've got to look after myself. And actually, not only is that very irritating for everyone else, but then you're starting to go outside your values that really matter. So you might be saying no, but adding to your own moral distress because you're not being the person that you want to be.
Yeah.
So it's kind of, I think kindness is tremendously helpful for mental health the whole way around. And I don't mean running around doing kind acts or, it's lovely when people bake cakes, but not all of us have got the ability or the time or the capacity.
Yeah.
But just being kind, smiling to your TA, being kind to the SLT when you do give feedback and say, look, I'm not feeling supported, or, to do it in a kind way rather than in an angry way. And SLT being kind.
Yeah.
And that just becomes infectious. I think when we're kind to other people, even when you drive to school or drive to work, just being kind to other road users, it actually helps us to be kinder to ourselves as well.
Yeah.
And it's just, and it's free and cheap
that
and
paying
easy.
it forward type.
Yeah.
Because I think for a lot of teachers, because I was speaking to a friend of mine who's a head teacher, and he was sort of deputy for a number of years. The head teacher left, so alongside another deputy, they became joint heads. And he was saying the thing that surprised him most about being a leader in a school or head teacher was just how incredibly lonely it was. And so, is there any advice for potentially any head teachers or just teachers to be aware of? How can we combat that? How can we?
I think it's really important for all teachers to be aware of, for the head, it is pretty lonely. And I feel very privileged, being a partner that's one of 8 of us. Whereas a head, it really is just them. So I think be aware that that's how it feels, and be aware that, when there's a complaint or, parents very cross or angry, that it's usually the head that's having to deal with that.
Yeah.
So I think, be kind to your head teachers.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean you have to do and say everything that they ask for you.
Oh, yeah. So it's striking the balance.
And it doesn't mean you have to put up with being bullied if that's where you're at. But it's, it is potentially, it's quite lonely because it's a very narrow pyramid at the top.
Yeah.
I think SLTs supporting each other. Really good communication is really key.
And do you think it's important to have people outside of education that you can reach out to?
For a head teacher?
Or just just for any teacher, because I find there's been a real change in attitude towards teachers, and sort of this job itself has really been devalued over the past few years in the media especially. And I think, again, that could be moral distress of, how teaching is perceived outside of education can become incredibly frustrating. I'll tell you the line, anytime I make a video where I'm questioning or ranting and arguing.
Ranting?
Yeah. The typical, must be that hard when you've got 13 weeks off.
Yeah.
You only work from 9 till 3, that's that. And I think that in itself can have a massive impact on teachers' mental health, or
I think so. I
suppose you might get it the same as being a doctor.
Well, you do as a GP. What I think there is an overlap because GPs and teachers are often bashed in the press.
Yeah.
And yet our core users, if I can use that term, are still very, very appreciative.
So,
our patients in our practice give such lovely feedback the vast majority of the time. of course, we're not immune to the odd complaint and getting the odd thing wrong. Similarly with teachers. And one reason why I would say sometimes as a teacher, no matter how tired you are, you might want to go to the school fair at a weekend, is because when you go to the school fair, you meet the 98% of parents who love the school, appreciate what you're doing, are really glad to see you. And actually, you can get a morale boost from that.
Oh, no. Yeah.
Whereas, certainly as a head teacher, most of your contact with parents is going to be with the upset ones and the grumpy ones. And it's actually those times when the school comes together and you realise, you know what? Most parents here are really appreciating what we're doing, and that really helps. And I think there's a place for reminding yourself how valuable it is. You did a little post after half term on Instagram where you were doing a lot of pep talk for teachers.
Yeah.
And there's lots of your usual humour and banter, but there was a real message of you could make a difference to a child's life this half term.
Yeah.
And recognising that and realising that actually what you do really is valuable, no matter what the press say and the government might say, and some moaning person on an Instagram post might say, there will be children whose lives you are transforming because of the input you're giving now. And you might never know, or you might hear in 20 years' time.
I don't know what it is. Is it something in our brains where, because I've had this before where, you could do, I've done conferences, courses to maybe 100 people. You do your evaluation forms, 99% say it's the best course I've ever been on. You'll get one who'll come, and then that sticks with you. And I mean, is that just something we're hardwired to focus on? Is there any way in which we can overcome that? Because like you say, for the majority of teachers, they're doing an incredible job. 99% of the parents are, more than happy, but you can get that one. And we have this, we just have this, I don't know what it is, to focus on it and let it outweigh the good that we're doing.
I think that's really, really common. I'm not sure, everyone is hardwired that way, but many of us have gone that way. And particularly if you've, always tried to please people, always, been trying to, I've got to do this to make everyone happy sort of person, then absolutely you notice the one bad thing. I think one thing that can be very helpful when you're trapped in thoughts, a thinking process that is not helping you, is to be able to step back from it and sort of objectively notice it.
Yeah.
So rather than be consumed by the feelings of, I'm really depressed because of that one bit of negative feedback, if you can identify that and notice it and just go, oh, here we go, here I am again. There's my sort of imposter syndrome bit. That's my lack of confidence bit, getting hammered a bit. I'm recognizing that. And actually, I can see that's happening. Can't necessarily stop it, but I know where that's coming from. That can help you step back from it a little bit, and that can be very, very helpful. It's quite a useful tip with anxiety in general to objectify it and observe yourself thinking.
Oh, brill. I know earlier on in the conversation you sort of mentioned holidays, and we sort of had a little bit of a chat about holidays, because I sometimes think, as much as the holidays are a bit of a perk, as well, it's probably the biggest perk, there is a tendency to become reliant on and I've sort of said they can sometimes sort of gaslight teachers in a way, in that we can feel we work to the holidays, we know we then pick up an illness for the first couple of days, we recover from that, we then have this week or couple of days where we're sort of going, oh, this is brilliant, isn't it? This is the best part of our job. And then we're back into that cycle, which can, again, be a factor towards burnout, as we've talked about. And you sort of talk about how it's sort of running, the analogy of sort of running long distance. Races.
There's something very unusual about teaching, that all the staff are on this termly cycle. And so it's like, every half term and every term is like all the staff start a long distance race at the same time. They're all quite fresh in September, and then it all gets a bit tired. And the pupils as well. The pupils, there's always a week towards the end of half term and towards the end of the year when, fights and, difficulties between pupils are more likely because they're all getting tired. And so everyone's fresh at the same time, and then everyone's exhausted at the same time. Whereas, most jobs, like my job, it's more like a relay race. As I'm getting tired because I haven't had a holiday for a while, one of my colleagues just come back from holiday and they're fresh, and they hand the baton. Well, I hand the baton on to them, and and we're not doing it all together. And to some extent, there's a camaraderie in that. Can we all get there? Only 2 weeks to go. So that it's not all bad, but it's quite unique. It's quite unusual. Yeah. And I think if the only thing that's sustaining you is getting to the holiday, that's a bit concerning when it comes to burnout, because the terms are long. Each half term is long, so you can't just live for the holidays. And when the adrenaline drops, absolutely, I will see teachers turn up in my surgery a week or two after term ill.
Oh, it's
with some reason or other. Yeah.
And is that just down to the fact we're just worn out, that we're more likely to pick up colds and illnesses? And
I mean, teachers, a bit like doctors, when you first start in general practice, you catch more bugs because particularly early on in your career, you're exposed to more. But I think it's a few reasons. I think definitely adrenaline can get you so far, and then the adrenaline level drops, and that's when you start feeling ill. I think also teachers, it's quite hard to see a doctor if you're a full-time teacher in the week, because when do you do it? And one of the the downside of teacher holidays is there's no flexibility. You can't say, I'll take a day off for this or that. So I think sometimes teachers come and see me in the holidays because that's when they've got permission to do so. And they should have come ages ago. Yeah.
I always joke about using the half term to just do all your life admin that you just don't get a chance to do during term time. Yeah.
And we, as doctors, some of us go on holiday in half term, and that's when all the teachers turn up. Think, oh no, we're understaffed. We've got all these teachers.
So what can we do to sort of mitigate that? Because it's like, with the system the way it is, we wouldn't be able to do what you've just said there of it being a relay race. So what can we do?
I mean, you can't change that. I think it's good to acknowledge it. It's good to recognise that actually this is part of the challenge. I think, I think a good old-fashioned pep talk from the head who's really inspiring you and, working together, a sense of team, can help with that. Because there is a sense of team in that, which can be a good thing. I think recognising, we're all very tired now, is helpful. I think, but you can't, that is what school life is like, isn't it?
Yeah.
And then I think each individual teacher needs to make sure that their week is sustainable and that actually they're not just living for the holidays.
Yeah.
There's one thing saying, I could do with a holiday. There's another thing saying, I can barely get there till the holiday. So somehow there needs to be rhythm in the week, not working 14-hour days every day and having some space at the weekends, which is a challenge.
So you say that you've been seeing, or you normally see teachers during the holidays. In the past few years, what do you feel has been potential? We sort of talked about imposter syndrome, but is there anything that you've seen a real rise in with teachers over the past few years as a GP?
I think anxiety has gone up generally. So I wouldn't say I've only seen anxiety rise in teachers, but I'd say...
But it's more common.
Yeah, and I mean, it's common
with everyone.
With everyone. And teachers are no exception to that.
Yeah.
There's definitely... really feels like there's a lot more anxiety around. I think there's more awareness of it, more willingness to go and see a GP about it, which is a good thing.
Yeah.
And, I don't have the scientific evidence to say it's definitely increased as well, although I think there was some WHO studies saying it's on the increase.
Yeah. Do you think that's down to, do you think it's just awareness, or do you think there's particular things causing us to be more anxious?
I think there are particular things causing it. I think modern life is much more demanding. I think, ultimately our system of anxiety was designed to help us deal with threat, and we've evolved to deal with threats of, wild beasts and the tribe next door coming to attack us and, not having enough food and all those sorts of things. And now we're having to deal with the threat of not being able to, too many emails and all this attention on our phone and demands to work silly hours. And so our body hasn't really evolved for a 21st century life.
Yeah.
And that's a real challenge. I think, the constant bombardment, one of the things that leads to burnout is just this sense of being overwhelmed.
Yeah.
And, just our phones can overwhelm us, can't they?
Absolutely.
access to a mobile phone, I think it's a big deal, for adults and, particularly for children and young people. I think, lockdown, without a doubt, had a big impact on mental health. And it's fascinating. Some of my patients felt very relieved going into lockdown because actually they'd felt very anxious being out in the world, and they now had permission to stay at home.
Yeah.
So in lockdown, they felt better, while other people had all their support systems cut off and their ability to exercise cut off, and they felt worse. But the ones that felt really relieved going into lockdown actually have found it really hard to come out. Going back out in the world.
Yeah.
Teachers obviously didn't do that. Everyone else was baking their sourdough, and teachers were
banana bread
doing virtual learning.
We were trying to teach through Microsoft Teams, which is an absolute nightmare.
A challenge.
So how would you define anxiety then?
So obviously a certain amount of anxiety is completely normal. It's normal to have anxious feelings. I was a little bit anxious coming here today, just thinking, am I going to get there on time? Is there anything going to go wrong? And that just makes sure that you pay attention.
Yeah.
So I think anxiety, when it becomes a problem, is when it starts having too much influence on your life. And that might be in a very defined area. It might be you're scared of spiders, and it just means that you can't go in a room with a spider.
Yeah.
That might be a minor inconvenience, or it might actually make life really difficult for you. And then you've got generalized anxiety, where you're just feeling anxious all the time. And it all depends on how much it's controlling your life. Is it affecting your ability to thrive, to do things? Is it making you avoid loads of things and limiting your life?
Yeah.
Because avoidance is a very almost defining part of anxiety, that we want to avoid the thing that makes us anxious. And you can easily get in a pattern of avoiding things because it makes you anxious. But the trouble is, the more you avoid it, the more out of practice you get.
Yeah.
And the more your sort of comfort zone where you feel okay gets smaller and smaller and smaller.
And so is that a way of battling anxiety? Well, I think first what you've just said there about accepting that we all get anxious is one, way towards it. But then sort of avoiding avoidance and actually taking the fear you have on is an important thing.
It is an important thing, particularly if it's important to you. The thing that anxiety is limiting you. So, if, for instance, anxiety stops you bungee jumping, which it does for me, I'd feel far too anxious to bungee jump. My life's pretty complete without bungee jumping. Yeah, not a big deal.
Yeah.
But if anxiety meant I couldn't get in a car, it'd be pretty inconvenient. If anxiety meant it was, I didn't like going into the high street or something, or I couldn't face, parts of my job, or I was just getting tremendously anxious every day going to work as a teacher, or as a pupil, I'm too anxious to go to school.
And I think that's a growing issue for a lot of young students, that sort of anxiety going to school.
And one of the things that's good is to practice living with anxious symptoms, because the issue with anxiety is it creates physical symptoms. Your heart races, you feel sweaty and clammy and sick and all of that. And very often the instinct is to say, I must not have those symptoms. So if we can practice actually having symptoms of anxiety, recognizing
is that not your body reacting to, because I was reading about this in terms of exam stress. And how to avoid that exam stress is that your body reacts to stressful situations by doing those things you've talked about. And so if you are feeling those feelings as a student, it's something you should embrace, because it's your body saying, right, we are going to be at our most alert. This is something that's really important, really. And so it's not something to, like we just said, avoid. It's something almost to embrace, to say, like, your body's ready for this. So you can...
and certainly to accept it. Because anxiety is trying to get us ready to deal with threat. And that might be the threat of, we've got to run away from, a wild animal or a fire or whatever. But it might also be the threat of, I might fail the exam. And so a certain amount of those anxious symptoms helps us to focus and remember to turn up and all of that. If you're so anxious that you can't concentrate, or you can't stop your hand shaking so you can't write, then obviously that becomes a problem. So practicing living with those anxious symptoms in other situations can help you when you're in a very stressful situation, like like an exam or a performance or something like that.
An inspection for teachers.
Or an inspection, yeah, absolutely. So accepting anxious symptoms is hard.
Yeah.
But it's really key.
And the right way of approaching it as well. So obviously, if you've got a child who is, I'm thinking here now more from a sort of parent's perspective, that if you feel like your child is anxious about potentially going to school, how do you go about that? Because obviously you want your child going there, but is there you can't force them because that can be counterproductive. So how would you go about that with your students or children?
So I think one thing is, way before they refuse to go to school, it's a matter of, as parents, and it's hard parenting, and we don't have to be perfect, we just have to kind of be good enough. I think good enough parenting is good enough. But can we allow them to face some of their struggles, to deal with anxiety, to practice situations that aren't easy, so that hopefully they don't get to a point of avoiding school entirely. Whereas if we've tried to fight every battle for them, if we've tried to protect them from anything that might be difficult,
which is a natural thing for us to do as parents, but can be counterproductive if we...
Absolutely. Yeah. Of course you want to protect your child, but you've got to think the bigger picture of, by protecting them from this little bit of conflict today, am I making life more difficult? Because they don't have that practice of dealing with...
And that resilience.
Once they've got to a point of, I'm not going to school, it's more difficult.
Yeah.
Because the right way to deal with something we're really anxious with is what's often called exposure therapy. I don't really like the word exposure because it sounds scary. And actually it's scary enough as it is. But if you're going to face up to the thing you're scared of, you need to be a willing participant.
Yeah.
And if you're just dragged into school, potentially you've got to be very careful, because that could be just very traumatic. If you need a bit of persuading and controlling and confidence building that you're going to be all right, that's very different to, forcing someone to be exposed to their fears.
Yeah.
And I, very often when you push yourself out of your comfort zone, you do it gradually. You gradually exposed to things. So ideally, you don't get to that place in the first place.
Yeah.
But you don't necessarily see it coming over the years of, whether or not a child can deal with deal with conflict and deal with challenge.
Yeah. I mean, I sometimes have those discussions with my wife, with our kids, because I'm very much like, I don't want to fight their battles, but my wife's very much more, protective. And it's just finding that balance, isn't it? Because I feel, and there are a lot of children now that don't have that resilience. And I feel it's so important. And we were just talking in the break before about, I feel like sport can play a real important role in exposing children to, dealing with loss, losing, not getting your way all the time. And so not always fighting their battles. Absolutely.
I think as parents, particularly looking for battles where it's safe to leave them to fight it.
Okay.
Like losing a football match.
Yeah.
And, helping them to deal with that loss.
Yeah.
Nothing traumatic's happened other than they've lost a football match. Rather than saying, no, you must go and fight that battle, which actually could be very traumatic for them. I don't know. So, when they fall out with other children at school, there'll be times when you think, actually, I just need to let them get on with this.
Yeah.
Let them know I'm with, I'm on their side. I'm supporting them. I'm there for them. But, I'm not going to rage in and try and solve it for them. There might be another issue at school where you think, no, actually, that's
the battle.
The way they've been dealt with there, I need to intervene. Because, some horrific bullying does happen.
Oh, absolutely.
But not to talk every time a child says something unkind that, they're being bullied, I've got to.
And I think for parents, it's hard to navigate that with
hard.
their youngsters with the mobile phone world we're sort of living in.
I feel really strongly that primary age children, I don't think should have a smartphone at all. And I don't think they should have one probably until, I don't know, year 11 or, why do they need it?
Yeah.
And it's...
Well, in the previous app, we were talking about banning it for under 16s. And I'm completely behind that now.
And what's really interesting is an awful lot of parents, I think, would be really for that if that culture was in the school. Yeah. But they don't want their child to be the one that's missing out.
Absolutely.
And actually, I think we should, help our children cope with fear of missing out. Actually, it's not so terrible.
I'm all for JOMO.
Yeah.
The joy of missing out.
Yeah. Oh, I heard of that before. I like that. Yeah.
Have you noticed then that would you say there's been a correlation as a GP in anything linked to children being exposed to smartphones and social media?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there are some really horrific ones where someone's been groomed and, and I've been aware of that as a GP in a way that's awful, truly awful.
Really worrying.
I think at a lower level, there's year 6 WhatsApp groups that you just, even if they're quite friendly, and often that sort of group can lapse. If you have a whole of year 6 and there's, I don't know, 3 classes, 100 children, and 80 of them are on a WhatsApp group, the number of messages that will come through, just destructive.
Well, it was so another thing I wanted to ask you in terms of phones and stuff, and this is both for children and because I've noticed it more as a teacher, I feel, is the attention. Because we're living in a world where if you're on your phone, you're constantly... Yeah. And I'm always like, we've got to let kids be bored.
Yeah.
Like we've got out of the habit of just letting children... Like when we were younger, we didn't have these phones where we were just constantly... you had your TV, but it was 4 channels. Yeah. And you were just sort of left to your own devices to be... And I think children are really missing out on the opportunities of being bored. Yeah. But I also feel it as an adult. Yeah. I feel like my attention's just...
Yeah.
You got any tips for that? How I can get my attention back? Because I find it really hard to focus.
Yeah.
I don't think I've always been like that. But I think because I spend a lot of my time, obviously because of my work, a lot of my work goes through my phone.
Yeah.
That I find it hard to...
I think one of the things with phones is it's so easy to pick up.
Yeah.
And sometimes if you want to stop doing something or do less of it, one of the best ways is to think, how can I devise a system that makes it harder to do? So if, for instance, where someone charges their phone, so many people charge their phone in their bedroom, which is terrible for sleep. And even if you've got it on airplane mode, it means if you wake in the night or when you wake in the morning, it's just quick to reach for it, which is not great. So even if you say, well, I'm going to charge my phone downstairs, then actually you've made it harder to pick it up.
Right.
And therefore you have to be more motivated to go and get it, and therefore you're less likely to do it. So, with what you do, you're going to need your phone on you a fair amount of the time, but there might be times where you say, actually, I'm going to boundary this and say, this time every week is phone free.
Yeah.
And that's where my phone goes, and I make it harder to reach it. Whereas if you say to yourself, well, on Wednesday nights, I'll try not to use my phone, but it's in your pocket.
Yeah,
you're not likely to succeed.
Yeah. So the other thing I wanted to ask, so obviously other mental health, imposter syndrome was one, because I feel that's just come out of nowhere.
Yeah.
And sort of it was, but it's, we talk about it a lot more.
Yeah.
I think teachers suffer with it quite a bit. The fact that we are, if you've just come into teaching, you're sort of there with a class of 30 children sort of thinking... I remember having these... I never knew it was imposter syndrome, but when I first started teaching, because I went straight in from uni, so I was like 22.
Yeah.
So incredibly mature myself, just like, who's put me in charge of these children? How am I supposed to... so is there anything that we can, sort of combat that or...
So I think imposter syndrome, it's actually a term I quite like. So it's obviously not a medical diagnosis, just a description of feeling like you're not up to the task when the evidence is that you are. I think it's quite useful giving it a name like that, because one of the things when you have thoughts that are unhelpful, whether they're anxious thoughts or questioning thoughts, they're often sort of what if thoughts. What if I'm not actually a good teacher? What if someone finds me out one day? What if I, don't teach well when I'm being observed? All those things will feed into that. And sometimes one of the most useful things you can do is to objectify your anxiety. So you name it, you observe it almost as if you're an external observer. You observe your thoughts, because we're not, our thoughts, we imagine our thoughts are us. They're not. Often thoughts just pop into our head. They don't define us. We're bigger than our thoughts. And so if you can say, okay, that's my imposter syndrome speaking, then you can step aside from it and then just say, well, I acknowledge you. I can see that you're there, but I'm not going to pay you any attention. And in fact, sort of broader than that, one thing on my Instagram and in a book I'm writing about anxiety, which isn't out yet, but will be out next year, I talk about an anxiety monster.
Right.
Because how you view your anxiety, if you have anxiety, is really important. And many people view it in different ways. So they might view it as a monster that might jump out at me at any time and cause a panic attack. And I'm all living in fear of it all the time, which isn't very helpful.
No.
Or it might be an enemy to fight. I dread my anxiety. It's awful. I have to fight it. And actually, there's enough stimulation with anxiety without you fighting something.
Yeah.
Or sometimes it's an overlord who has to be obeyed. I can't do that because of my anxiety, or I couldn't possibly because of my anxiety. I have to do this because of my anxiety. You're kind of just passive.
Yeah.
And those are ones to fall into, but none of them are very helpful. And what I like is imagining, so this is for adults. I think it works for children, but I'm not thinking of this as a children thing.
Right.
Imagining your anxiety as a monster that wants to protect you, but actually isn't a very good monster. So you picture a slightly silly monster, maybe with goofy teeth or bulgy eyes, or that's trying to be scary but not very good at it, that's like always on alert saying, oh, watch out for this, watch out for that. But
I can't fight that, but I can tell you about it, sort of thing,
And they kind of need taming.
Yeah.
And to even actually imagine what it looks like, what color is it, what's its teeth like, what's it look like, and even giving it a name. So in my Instagram, I call it Wilbur.
Right.
Just because I don't know any Wilburs, so it doesn't color what I imagine. And so then you might go, okay, I'm really anxious about today. And you might even say, okay, Wilbur, I hear you, I see you. You're raging a bit. You're a bit noisy today, aren't you? Teachers are probably quite good at thinking, yeah, I spot you.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to fight you. I'm not going to try and disprove you. I'm just acknowledging you, but I'm not going to pay you any more attention than I have to. And that can be a really useful way of accepting your anxiety. You'll then find that actually the anxious symptoms over time, it's not going to happen immediately, but start diminishing because you become less fearful of it.
Yeah.
The monster that could jump out at any time, the enemy to fight, the overlord, they're all fearful. Whereas this little cuddly, rather stupid, yappy Wilbur who, is trying to protect you but keeps going off at all, actually that can bring a bit of humor and a bit of a smile to how you think about your anxiety, and then you're less fearful of it, and then you can gradually manage it better.
I actually think that's an amazing analogy for young people as well. I think that would be very relatable. I think that's a great way of approaching it, and a lovely point to sort of wrap up our conversation. It's been fantastic. I've learned a lot. I hope everyone listening to it has as well. And thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you very much, Lee. Really enjoyed chatting to you.
Me too. Thank you. Cheers.
Thank you.
So a massive thank you to everyone for listening. I would also like to say a huge thank you to our guest, Dr. Martin Brunet, for joining us and providing such valuable insights. I took so much away from that conversation. I hope you did too. I love that analogy about the monster with anxiety. I think that's something I'm definitely going to refer to and use. That's also tied in really nicely with the fact that I took my kids to go and see Inside Out 2 recently at the cinema, which I would highly recommend because, again, a great sort of analogy of how to deal with anxiety. And if you are a child of children heading into those teenage years, which is where I'm at and absolutely dreading it,
really help with that alongside that conversation there. But you've been listening to the TTS Talking Teachers podcast with me, Lee Parkinson, aka Mr. P. If you've been inspired by our conversation today, don't forget you can sign up via the link in our episode notes to be the first to hear about future episodes and access exclusive follow-up content, including ideas for your school and links to relevant resources. Once again, thank you very much for listening and take care of yourself.